All right, so here is postmodernism art, and we think of the postmodern era starting around 1900. On the left is a map of what Europe looked like before World War I, and on the right is what the map looked like after World War I, and we can see how Germany and Austria-Hungary and Poland now exists. USSR's territory, well, we have the USSR. Its territory has shrunk. We have a lot of new countries that were created out of the Balkan regions. But the borders around France, Belgium, Netherlands, Great Britain, Spain, those and Italy are all pretty much the same. And again, the heart of the art world we're going to be talking about in this section is largely French, German, and Spanish. And then later on, we'll be talking about art from the United States. Okay, so starting with historical context. So this is a period of significant worldwide upheaval. Between 1900 and 1945, there were 2 world wars. We see the rise in different political philosophies like communism and fascism take over parts of Europe and other places. And it also, in between those wars, is the Great Depression, and that was a global depression. That wasn't just, I know for those of you guys who have taken 11th and 12th grade, the Great Depression is a big part of it, but we never necessarily talk about it in a global frame of mind. And it's going to hit Europe first, and then that will then trickle to the United States. And there's other reasons why, but that's really important. There's going to be a time of radical change within the arts, and artists really begin to challenge basic assumptions about what is the purpose of art, or even how is the form of art significant. And so it's really going to be, again, esoteric, avant-garde, trying to outdo the generation or just even their peers as we see the different periods move on. So with World War I, it will, once it's over, the world as we know it, well, or at least the world as they know it, will transform. Oh, oops, sorry. There we go. We'll get to the Communist Revolution in a second. Okay, so with World War I, it's going to transfer almost every aspect of Western society, including politics, economics, and culture. The war, as you guys know, was fought with 20th century technology, but 19th century military strategies. And as a result, we had a huge number of casualties that the world had never seen before. And it's going to affect the psyche of the generations that surround the Great War. As a result, people and artists in particular will begin to question, is society really as progressive as they thought that it was? And also they're going to question the political order and the social order of the world. The Communist Revolution in Russia is going to coincide with the ending years of World War I and finish off in 1924 after the death of Lenin, and Stalin becomes the dictator by the end of the 1920s. The Bolsheviks is going to be led by Vladimir Lenin, and they're going to stage their October Revolution in 1917, and that one's going to be based on Karl Marx's theories adapted to a Russian country that is largely agrarian, and that's going to be a difficult sell for a lot of the people who are very religious in Russia. And Russia was not a highly industrialized society. The basic assumptions that Karl Marx and Frederick Engels put out, that the proletariat is going to rise up, doesn't really happen in Russia, but Lenin sort of makes that happen. And so, anyway, the Communist Party is going to be founded by Vladimir Lenin, and he will be the leader of the United Socialist Soviet Republics, or the USSR, between 1917 until he died fairly young of a cerebral brain hemorrhage in 1924. And the Soviet Union was technically given its name in 1922 after the end of a bloody civil war between the whites and the reds. And then after after Lenin dies, Stalin will rule this country as a totalitarian dictatorship until his death in 1953. Let's see, the Depression will begin. Oh, when we talked about that, let's go to, so the Great Depression and totalitarianism. Like I said before, it wasn't just, for the United States, the Depression really started in the early 30s and didn't come out of it until after World War II. But it began earlier in Germany. It begins earlier in the rest of Europe. And it's really brought on by an economic collapse following World War I, where the structure of, there's so many men who are dead that they couldn't necessarily rebuild as quickly as they needed. And so the United States becomes a superpower as a result, because even though we were part of the war, we're largely going to be unscathed by it. And although we will be involved in the Great Depression. So, let's see, what's next? Okay, so then World War II, most of the European countries are going to develop after the economic collapse of the Great Depression. Now, between the 1920s and World War II, we'll see like this era is kind of an incubator for totalitarianism and fascism to develop. Totalitarianism and fascism is slightly different. With totalitarianism, it's a total control by one leader, and you can be fascist and still be totalitarian. Totalitarian is kind of this big umbrella conversation, but the fascism first takes root in Italy in 1922 when Mussolini comes to power. Germany turns fascist in 1932 when their new Reichstag, or their government, is going to be a multi-party system. And in 1932, the Nazis gained the most votes in a multi-party system, so they created a coalition government, and the head of the Nazi party becomes the prime minister, which is going to be Adolf Hitler. And so they're going to start rebuilding. Both of those countries start rebuilding and start thinking about empires, while the rest of Europe and the United States are just sunk into that depression. Let's see. When Francisco Franco comes to power in Spain, he is going to emerge victorious in the Civil War, and he ruled Spain from 1939 all the way until his death in 1975. With World War II, the human carnage from this war is even greater than it was for World War I. Both military and civilian deaths outnumber World War I's, and people begin to question our humanity. The end of World War II, with the explosion of the nuclear bombs in Japan, will usher the atomic age and the constant threat of nuclear war. After the war, the increasing industrialization and prosperity in the United States, Japan, and Europe will lead to an even greater gap between the Western world and the rest of the world. So the Great Migration is a U.S. Thing. This is something you'll learn in 11th grade, or have already learned. And this is because it happened during the World War I. Between 1910 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans migrate out of the rural South and head to areas in the Northeast, Midwest, and West looking for jobs. And that's going to be happen because so many people during World War I, so many men are going to leave and fight in World War I. Let's see. There's a communist revolution in China in 1949, which is going to be considered a loss from the United States containment policies. And ideologies during this time struggle for, they're really going to struggle for their control is going to be communism and capitalism, and in between fascism. Capitalism belongs in the United States, Great Britain, and most of Western Europe. There's also going to be a scientific and technological revolution. The first powered flight was in 1903. There was the electrification of most of the Western world during the 1920s. The first public radio broadcast happened in 1920. There's also the development of television. It developed in 1926, but didn't really become widespread until after World War II. The jet engine was created in 1937. Other things that's also really significant is the invention of better medications for prolonging life, particularly antibiotics. And then they also created more efficient warfare weaponry. And all of this helps make information from the outside world more accessible with the invention of radio and television and film. The big thinkers that are going to inform our artists include Einstein, who published the special theory of relativity in 1905 that shook the foundations of Newtonian physics, and it radically changed our concept of time and space. Sigmund Freud published his interpretation of dreams in 1900. It argued our behaviors are not motivated by reason, but by a powerful subconscious force that works below our awareness. And then Carl Jung, he extended and modified and at times even countered Freud's theories to develop additional scientific insight into psychology. And he advances the notion of what's called a collective unconscious, which is a layer of unconsciousness that underlies a personal unconscious that is carried through our inherited disposition of our species as a whole. Okay, so that was historical context. I know it was a lot, that it's a big chunk of history that you guys just went over. And next will be the style and characteristics. Okay.